This week's video is the second part of a two-part series that discusses in great detail the throwing and trimming of a 2-pound stoneware bowl. There's an awful lot to discuss about this process. Essentially, it's all about removing the excess weight that's left on the thrown piece and to refine the bowl's shape. And the first thing I want to mention is keeping the wheel head clean as you're trimming. When it's actually time to trim the bowl and place it onto the metal wheel head, I make sure it's been scraped clean of any specks of clay or pieces of dirt that would otherwise embed themselves back into the delicate rim of the thrown piece, as it only takes 2 or 3 seconds to clean the wheel, whereas fixing a damaged or marked rim can take significantly longer. Another thing you'll often hear is that you should never trim the inside of your pieces, as the correct shape should have been achieved at the throwing stage. And whilst it is good practice to finish your pots with that level of finesse, there are sometimes pots which do need some correcting, or simply the shape refining. I'm a potter who loves to trim, and making sure my curves are perfectly smooth and that the edges are crisp and sharp is something I'll often do at this leather hard stage. For bowls in particular, I recommend trimming the inside of the vessel before you turn the foot ring and the underside, as there's still all that excess clay underneath. It'll support the trimming done from the inside. And for those wondering how I've secured the bowl in place, I just centered it and then squashed 3 lumps of soft clay around it. But as you can see, this isn't so much trimming as it is just shaping and refining. I'm not removing much material. I'm just making sure the curve is right and that I'm burnishing a few areas. And as this is a new form for me, or one that I'm not particularly comfortable trimming yet, before I begin to really remove mass from the outside, I'll just feel the cross-section of the walls of the vessel. That way I can gain an understanding of which parts of the pot need to be trimmed the most, and I can also identify the areas where I shouldn't trim much from, which on this bowl is the top indented section. I also make sure to pick the pot up and feel the thickness of the base too, which was thrown purposefully thick, so that I could trim a nice tall foot ring from it. So, when it's time to place the bowl down onto the metal wheel head, I make sure I scrape it clean and then carefully lower it down. I then tap center the bowl so that it spins directly in the middle of the wheel, and I'll leave a link on screen now and in the description below to a video that goes over the process of tap centering in far greater detail. As I want to trim the indented section of this bowl, I can't place these 3 lumps of clay down to support it and hold it in place, as my trimming tool would simply hit into them. So instead, I place a spinner on top and apply a lot of downward pressure through it, which pins the bowl down in place, and it means I can trim this section of the pot without the bowl coming off center. And keeping it on center is crucial throughout this entire process, as it's that keeps the trimming neat and even. Once I've trimmed this section to have an appropriate curve, I burnish the clay a touch, just to smooth over the surface, and then I can remove the spinner and secure the pot down with 3 lumps of soft clay. Now when I attach these, I don't push them towards the pot. Instead I just push directly down, and I let the clay that squashes out be the clay that holds the bowl in place. If instead I just pushed it directly into the rim, there's a good chance I'd deform it. And their placement is important too. They're positioned evenly around the bowl, as if they were the points of a triangle. And now that the bowl has been secured in place, I can begin to trim the bottom. I use a pair of calipers and a sharp potter's needle to score a line onto the bottom. This is a boundary for the outermost part of my foot ring, and especially when I'm repetition making, I make sure the calipers are set to a specific measurement. That way the feet on every single one of my bowls are exactly the same. In this instance though, as this is a one-off piece, it doesn't matter quite so much, but I still find it useful having the line as a visual indicator to mark where not to trim past. Now, as for the actual trimming itself, I tend to do it in 2 parts. There's the inside of the foot ring, and then there's the outside, and I always begin by trimming the outside first. Just one quick note about the clay's condition. If you're turning and you find that your trimmings are sticking back down onto your pot immediately, then your pot is too soft to be trimming. The ribbons of clay should peel away and fall straight into the wheel tray. And there's a second important thing I do here, which is constantly apply some kind of downward pressure, either with my hand or the spinner tool. The spinner tends to distribute the weight that's pushed down, whereas when I use just my fingertips, the pressure is a lot more focused on one spot. So in this instance, as the base is quite thick, I can just use my fingers, as there's no risk of indenting or damaging a thin base, like on a mug for instance. Either way, as you trim, you need to apply some downward pressure, and using a spinner versus your hands is simply situational, as both serve the same purpose and prevent the bowl from jumping up as you're trimming. Another thing that's worth discussing is how you hold the trimming tool itself. You want to hold it very firmly near the blade's end of the tool. And when I'm trimming, I tuck my elbow into my torso and I lean my upper body weight onto that arm. All of this helps to add stability to my movements as I'm trimming, and holding the tool and positioning your body correctly really goes a long way. And what you shouldn't do is hold the tool like this at the end as you turn, as you'll simply have no control and you'll be at the whim of the pot on the wheel. So instead, it's best to grip the tool firmly by the bladed end. You can also add stability to your movements by connecting your thumbs together as you trim, instead of holding your hands freely like so. So instead, I connect the two. I place my thumbs together, either simply resting them together or straddling one hand with the other. And at the beginning, if you're learning to trim, you might have to make a real conscious effort to do this, but after a while, you'll end up doing it completely subconsciously. And with all of that taken in, now the trimming can begin properly. The bases of my thumbs are connected. I'm applying pressure down with my left hand, and I'm grasping the tool right by the end near the blade, so that I can really push it into the curved walls of the bowl. And as you can see, all the trimmings are just coming off and filling up the tray, instead of just sticking back onto the pot. And once again, I interlock my thumbs, and I lean my upper body weight onto my arms, and I make very defined, steady movements. If any slight wobble or bump does come along, I want to trim right through it to eliminate it, instead of letting that undulation influence my turning, which would cause the wobble to exaggerate as time goes by. I always begin by removing a majority of the mass from the lower sections of the walls, and then I use a smaller trimming tool to define the foot section of the bowl. And now there are two very distinct regions of this piece, the bowl itself and the foot. And in my mind's eye, I'm recalling the cross-section I felt before placing the pot down onto the wheel, and I trim away the clay accordingly. Next, I trim two distinct facets onto the outside of the foot ring, and for this I use a smaller trimming tool, which is much more appropriate for turning a delicate facet like this. There are dozens of ways of trimming foot rings, and ultimately you'll find one which fits your style best. This particular way of doing it is just the method I've landed upon after 10 years of making pots. But there is a functional element to these grooves, especially this inward facing facet that I'm turning now. This creates a groove which partly acts as a glaze catch. It prevents the glaze that's cascading down the overhanging curved walls from running over the foot and onto the kiln shelf, which would fuse the pot in its place, and it'll likely mean that the pot is damaged or broken as it's removed. My only general rule for these facets is that they mirror each other in terms of angle, and that they're more or less the exact same size. Eventually I will stamp my maker's mark onto the lowest facet, which is the topmost one here, as the bowl is upside down, so it needs to be smooth and flat so my maker's mark can sink neatly into it. And now that the outside section of the pot is finished, I can finally begin to hollow out the inside of the footwell. If you find that your base is a little bit uneven, you can trim it flat. For this I use a flat edge tool as opposed to a curved one, and simply focus my eye on the blade and trim until the blade itself doesn't undulate whatsoever and runs completely smooth and flat on top of the foot ring. If instead you see the tool bouncing up and down and following the rhythm of the clay, then you aren't holding the tool firmly enough, and perhaps more importantly, you aren't trimming with enough conviction. You want the tool's blade to simply slice through any bump rather than follow it. I then spend a moment trimming it to be completely smooth, and then burnish the very outer portion with the flat surface of a metal kidney. Next, I use a trimming tool which has a sharp corner to gradually gouge out the clay from inside the foot. I always start in the middle and work my way outward. For this first pass, I don't worry about removing too much material. Instead, I just set the groundworks and carefully define the edge of the innermost portion of the foot ring, which is what I'm doing now. And once I've set this boundary, I'll more vigorously remove clay from inside the foot, although I'll never trim beyond this boundary that I've set myself. Think of it like using a brush to carefully paint above the skirting on a wall, and once that area has been carefully defined, you can use a larger paint roller for the rest of the wall without having to be too careful about how it meets the actual boundary. I like my foot rings to be delicate, but they can't be too fine, otherwise they'll have a tendency to warp when fired to high temperatures, and if the foot ring's too thick or wide, it just won't match the delicacy of the rest of the vessel. But now this portion is set, I won't touch it again. I'll just focus on hollowing out the middle, and I want to bring the level down so that it matches the outside curve of the bowl. And by that I mean that this inner portion shouldn't look as if it's higher than the outside portion of the bowl, as otherwise visually I think the bowl will look quite clumsy, and it's quite obvious that there's excess material that could have been removed, but wasn't. And this ultimately means that you have a bowl with wasted clay in it, and a bowl that's heavier than it needs be. It's incredibly easy during this process for the tool to catch, and in doing so, you might accidentally trim into the outer portion of the foot. So I take it slow. I remove clay bit by bit. If I feel like there's too much clay on the tool and I can't see what I'm doing visually, then I'll stop what I'm doing, remove the clay, and I'll begin again. Likewise, if you feel that the tool is beginning to catch or shudder slightly, it's best to stop, assess what's going on, remove the clay if needs be, and then continue trimming. Sometimes the wads of clay that are holding the pot in place around the rim will become slightly loose and the bowl will begin to rattle in situ. So if you notice that, it's best to take the waddings off, recenter the pot, securely position the wads of clay back on again, and then begin trimming. When I'm trying to remove a lot of clay, I always work from the middle and work outward, and as I trim, my left hand isn't totally inactive. Instead it's pushing inward from both the foot ring and the curve of the bowl. It sort of acts like a seismometer. It's with this hand that I begin to detect any irregularities or slight undulations in the form, if one side of the bowl slumps, or if it rattles as the lugs of clay have dried out a bit too much. Then it's my left hand, which is cradling the bowl, which will notice it first. As the level gets lower, I begin to check the thickness of the base every now and then, either by pushing it very lightly and seeing if it moves, or by tapping it with a tool or with a flick of a finger to hear how it resonates. A low thud usually means it's quite thick, whereas a higher pitched noise means it's quite thin. Once I'm happy with the depth, I'll begin to clean up the surfaces inside the foot ring. I trim the inner portion of the foot ring here so that it reflects the groove trimmed on the outside. As for the edges of the foot ring, I trim it flat, and then I use the pads of my fingers just to burnish those sharper points smooth. In this instance, I noticed that I was able to trim the inside foot ring a bit lower than the external walls, which is usually a sign that a touch more clay can be removed from the outside form. So I just go back to the outside curve and trim away a few more millimeters leading up to the foot ring. And I find it's these instances where really sharp tools make all the difference. As if I was using a cheap, perhaps more blunted tool, the pressure I'd have to exert with it in order to get it to cut on an already thin portion of the wall would likely cause that part of the wall to deform and buckle inward, whereas with a very sharp turning tool, you don't actually need to push it in very hard in order for it to remove clay. And finally I push in my handmade maker's mark, which in doing so displaces a tiny amount of clay upward, creating a small bump, but this is easy to fix, and I just use a fine turning tool to trim that portion back down again so that it's flush. And then I burnish over those sharp edges with my fingertips. And that's the bowl more or less finished. The supporting wads of clay are then carefully removed, and the bowl is lifted away via the foot. If you find that your fingers sink into the clay of the foot ring when you do this, then once again, the clay is too soft to be trimming in the first place. Occasionally you might find that the interior form of your bowl might be very slightly deformed after trimming, and in those cases I just run a metal kidney over the surface to correct it. And that's it for the bowl. It's a simple vessel, but the process itself of trimming is quite complex. There's a lot to think about in terms of proportion, the weight of the piece, how it feels when held and used, of course, although that's more difficult to test. And finally, I'll just discuss the tools I used for this process and what some of the differences are between some of the bladed trimmers. For the most part, when I'm trying to remove a lot of clay at once, I use these bison turning tools. They're incredibly sharp and they're made from tungsten carbide, which means the blades themselves are quite fragile. Yet, in comparison to cheaper turning tools, the blades remain sharp for much longer. The set of bison tools I've been using feel as sharp as the day I got them, and they've easily trimmed through several thousand pots so far. Not only that, but Philpo Burker, who makes them, turns their wooden handles to fit your hand exactly, so it goes without saying that I can't recommend these enough, although they are becoming increasingly difficult to obtain. And I've always thought that it's quite unusual that no one in the UK properly produces these types of tools. I've tried and tested a few different things, but nothing even comes remotely close to the tools that Phil makes. And this is no means an advert, and I'm not being paid to say this, they're just fantastic things. And next to these, which are just very cheap and generic turning tools, there's really no comparison. But that's not to say that these aren't useful, they really are. The Bicing turning tools can tend to chatter a tiny amount when used on a grogged clay, whereas these don't. They simply leave a very smooth, clean, and somewhat burnished surface, although you can see here just how much the metal of the blade wears away with use. So in short, these don't last long, but they are still very useful, and I actually really love the shape of these blades, especially for trimming out the hollow of the footwell. I just wish someone would make tungsten carbide equivalents. For the time being, I just buy new versions of these every time I wear through a pair. The other turning tools aren't quite so critical. I make good use of a slightly flexible metal kidney. I prefer the slightly thicker ones, partly because the edge isn't quite so lethal. As for the calipers I use, I love this pair made by Taranti. They're cast aluminium, they're incredibly sturdy, and they can be tightened really well. And I find that plastic calipers often become loose quite easily, which is a disaster if you're making lids or something, whereas once these are properly tightened, they barely budge. And they're also quite fine overall, and with the plastic ones, as they're quite a weak, flexible material, they have to compensate by using a lot of plastic in the arms to keep them sturdy, whereas the points and arms of these are very fine. Lastly, there's my maker's mark, which I hand-carved myself from a small block of porcelain, and then my friend Mark Tallowan added the cordage that's seen on the ends of them, and this tiny one was made specifically to stamp the lower facet on the foot ring of my bowls. Like I said, one day, I promise, I'll make a video showing how I carve these. And as for keeping my tungsten carbide tools safe, I keep them in this simple padded box, as if they were to roll off my workbench and onto the hard concrete floor, the blades would just shatter or chip. So I keep them in this box, even when I'm working. They aren't cheap tools, and they are hard to get hold of, so I'll be distraught if one was broken. Anyhow, thanks so much for watching if you made it this far, and if you would like to see more of my content, make sure you follow my Instagram. I post videos, photographs and stories there pretty much every day. Thanks again, and I'll see you next week.